Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the mainstream media's role in drumming up the wars against Syria and other places right now, and kind of try and put it in perspective from the journalist's point of view, in a way, try to examine how the media itself is structured right now. So human beings are extremely sensitive to propaganda. It's how we make sense of the world around us, by receiving input from other people. If I was having a hallucination right now that there is a pink elephant in the room, right, everyone would be able to tell me that that's not really there, and without running any kind of tests, scientific tests or something, that's how I would get the idea that I was having a hallucination. Sure, we can run, this is basically how we orient our own reality right now, by interacting and consulting with others and receiving information. With this input comes the ideology of the ruling class, however, and it's really clear who is the ruling class in this country. You can see it every waking moment of every day, on the subway, on the internet, on television, just walking down the street: white supremacy, misogyny, LGBTQ phobia, xenophobia, dehumanization, shame, and war. As Marxists, we understand that everything happens for a reason. So why has the bourgeois media been so totally complicit, so criminally negligent about the war against our class, both at home and abroad, in these recent days? First, we have to understand that when we speak about the media, we're not speaking of a single thing. We are speaking about hundreds of thousands of people all over the world who depend on it for their livelihood. Whether or not they're working in sales or on the front line doing the reporting, they need to eat. And it doesn't hurt that also everyone wants to be famous nowadays. But my point is that just as there are many who worked in the Detroit car industry, it was the bosses themselves who cashed in and sold out the workers. A sliver of super rich, of super powerful, made the decision for the rest of us. They were driven by what always drives them: the need to maximize profit. So when the internet came around, the print media got really scared. And then when high-speed internet arrived, television media got really scared. I'd just like to take a quick show of hands. How many people in this room own a television? Okay, how many people in this room bought a magazine this week? Okay, so I can see their fears are somewhat justified in that regard. So here's my point. So these huge conglomerates got scared, and they've been scampering ever since to try and figure out a way to keep their doors open. But the thing is that the news media is never going to go away. It's a de facto arm of the government. It's what's called the fourth estate. The state and the capitalists need the media to jam all this racist, sexist, warmongering bullshit down our throats so that we'll keep working, keep spending, keep living life in fear and anxiety. But the media is supposed to be privately owned, allegedly. So sure, we have a few public entities rolling around out there, but in general, it's supposed to be independent, or whatever they call it. People turn up their noses at the idea of state-run media, but it doesn't really matter at all, that much at all anymore, because no media, especially under this system, is independent. So the media has always obviously taken money, from companies in this country to be able to run ads, but this is different because it's posing as actual news. Now I'd like to bring up another aspect of the news media quickly: the freelancer. With the advent of new media, quote-unquote, layoffs ensued, bureaus closed, and suddenly a salaried position turned into a $200 a story kind of deal. Major publications were even trying to not pay a dime to people who were writing for them. And I ask you, how are you supposed to do a good and honest investigative journalism on $200 a story? So this is where then the PR firms come in. Now, I'm sure everyone here has already heard about the white helmets, but I can go over it again. Shortly after the creation, sorry, I'm going to start way in the back here. So shortly after the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947, the U.S. Congress passed what was called the Smith-Mundt Act, which outlined what the U.S. government was allowed to do in terms of directly propagandizing to people who live inside the United States. It's totally legal, of course, for, like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, or whatever, to do that abroad, but there was this law that was passed in 47 that basically said you're not allowed to do that here. In 2013, however, parts of this act were actually repealed. Months later, there was this thing called the Syria campaign that started up in London, and it was actually run by a PR firm that's here in New York. We've picketed it. It targeted young, Occupy-era journalists who were eager to make a little bit more than $200 writing a story. Suddenly, you had all of these young people, these young freelancers flying around the world with exclusive access to all of these different sources that were presented on a plate to them by these sorts of PR agencies. Anecdotally, actually, a journalist that I know who's based out of town told me that a journalist that they know, so I mean it's a they know kind of thing, was actually approached and offered more than $10,000 a month to move to Turkey and write PR copy based as like posing as news stories for the US-backed FSA, Free Syrian Army. And I actually believe that story, I'll be honest with you, just knowing what I know about the world. So there are no editors here to make them disclose what kind of information they're getting or how they're getting paid. And there are no funding inquiries that these private PR firms are actually required to answer. They're not required to answer by law how they get their money and how much they pay people. Now, if you're a freelance journalist, you suddenly find yourself competing in a very different kind of job market. Now you have to be a mercenary, basically, and you better stay on the boss's good side to keep getting the paychecks. And if you really want to be on the boss's good side and you really want to get those transatlantic flights paid for, then you're going to have to talk about wanting to bomb the shit out of Syria. While journalists are really supposed to be asking questions as their job, suddenly it's become very clear what questions you're not supposed to be asking people. So late last December, before Barack Obama left office, he actually repealed the last remaining vestiges of the Smith-Mundt Act. Now it's actually totally legal for the United States government to propagandize directly to people living here by paying journalists. It's a response to the so-called fake news. It's a response to that so-called Russian propaganda or any other kind of propaganda, that it's totally okay now to just cut checks to journalists and get them to counter that foreign kind of perspective. What we have now are more and more journalists that are working in an intense state of anxiety and fear. They are either freelance, in which case they have to constantly appear marketable while firing off tweets and Facebook updates that could be held against them, making sure that they appeal to potential clients. Or they're institutional journalists, and they're looking at freelancers like the ones who were picked up at J20, who are facing life in prison for doing their jobs, and saying, my goodness, I really better make sure I stay on my boss's good side. Sorry. And their bosses themselves are actually now basically dependent on what amounts to a block grant from different governments or major corporations. So this is a serious challenge that needs to be tackled. How to spread the message of socialism in this day and age when we're running up against such a brick wall when it comes to the media? Why are journalists so terrified to report on the truth and their editors focus more on money than integrity? And I gotta be honest with all y'all, social media is a dead end. It's a feedback loop. There's only really so far that you can take it without, Twitter or Facebook just shutting it down. So this is a serious challenge. I think that the newspaper that we have here is actually more important than ever, as is the kind of in-your-face propaganda to be able to raise people's awareness, on the street. I think more and more people, like you were saying, Faikwan, more and more people are starting to kind of realize that everyone has been had. And I think that, I guess there were some numbers that came out a while ago that said that the only institution in the United States that scored lower than Congress when it came to trusting it was the media. So I mean, it's no joke. So I mean, I hope that we're going to address this part in the working section of the meeting, but just basically how to raise the profile in people's everyday lives. We have to get people out of their cell phones when they're on the fucking subway, right? We've got to actually raise awareness by doing things that are in your face, that put the papers in people's hands, and I think we can go from there. So thank you very much.
Yeah.